In 1889, a Victorian magazine asked unmarried women why they refused to marry, and the answers were savage. One wrote that men were less affectionate than a cat and less amusing than a monkey. Another compared marriage to an electric battery. Once you grabbed hold, you couldn't let go, no matter how much it hurt. But here's the thing. In Victorian England, refusing marriage wasn't quirky or empowering. It was dangerous. To say no to the altar meant risking poverty, ridicule, and being labeled one of the dreaded, redundant women. Your entire life became a cautionary tale whispered over teacups. So, dim the lights, settle back, and let the sound of ticking clocks and rustling skirts carry you into history. And subscribe, because if you don't, the Victorians will erase you too, quietly filed away as irrelevant. Prove them wrong, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are listening? I'm always curious to know. You wake up to the creak of the floorboards overhead, the muffled thump of someone in the corridor, and the faint smell of tea drifting up from the kitchen. But none of that matters, because you are 26 years old, unmarried, and by Victorian standards, finished. Yes, finished. Past your season, past your sell-by date, past the point of polite optimism. At best, you're whispered about in the village as independent. At worst, you're lumped into that ominous census category, redundant. The Victorians had a knack for taking words that sounded vaguely practical and making them sting like a slap. Redundant meant you refused or you failed. Either way, society has decided there's no use for you. You open your eyes, stare up at the floral wallpaper, roses that look slightly too cheerful for the mood, and sigh. The morning light creeps through lace curtains, catching on the embroidered sampler above your bed. It reads, "Patience is a virtue." You hate that sampler. Your aunt embroidered it for you after you turned 25, as if patience were a replacement for prospects. The room is quiet, almost too quiet. No sound of children stomping through the hallway. No husband shouting for his misplaced cravat. Just the steady tick of the mantel clock and the rustle of fabric as you roll over, debating whether to get up or stay cocooned under the blankets. The great advantage of refusing marriage: no one to drag you out of bed. The disadvantage: everyone assumes you're still asleep because you've got nothing better to do. You finally swing your legs over the side of the bed and grope for your slippers. One is missing, naturally, somewhere between the chair and the copy of Sense and Sensibility you read last night. It has vanished. Perhaps the cat knows where it went. She often does. She also knows all your secrets, how many proposals you turned down, how many letters you crumpled, how many nights you sat awake wondering if you made a mistake. She keeps your confidence better than most of your relatives. And those relatives, oh, they never let you forget what you've done. Every refusal of a proposal was not just your personal decision, but an assault on the family's social standing. Remember when you rejected Cousin Neville? Yes, his breath smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. And yes, his idea of romance was reciting crop yields at supper. But he was willing. You, on the other hand, were unwilling. And unwillingness was almost worse than inability. A woman who could not marry was pitied. A woman who would not marry was dangerous. You cross to the washstand. The water in the jug is cold, of course. It always is. You splash your face, wincing as the icy drops trickle down your neck, and catch a glimpse of yourself in the slightly tarnished mirror. A little older than last season, though not by much. A little sharper around the eyes. Still attractive enough, if one were being fair. But in the unforgiving arithmetic of the Victorian marriage market, beauty depreciates faster than tulips after a frost. You wrap yourself in your morning gown, beige, practical, resigned, and tie the sash. Not a wife's gown, not a bride's gown, just something neutral, worn by someone who exists in the liminal space between daughter and burden. You walk back to the window and lift the curtain an inch. Outside, the world is stirring. Milk carts rattling by, children scurrying to school, respectable wives arranging flowers in their parlors where everyone can see. You notice the neighbor's daughter, married at 19, already pushing a pram. She glances up, sees you in the window, and quickly looks away. Pity mixed with relief. She's chained to a husband, a baby, and endless laundry, but at least she's not you. You smile, just a little. Because pity cuts both ways. Your refusal to marry, after all, wasn't reckless. It was deliberate. You could have married Neville with the cabbage breath, or Mr. Harrow, the widower who offered security and a lifetime of explaining to his children why they must obey you, or even that curate with the alarming eyebrows who spoke more about coal prices than scripture. But no, you said no. Again and again, you said no. And now here you are, 26, unmarried, and the embodiment of the thing your relatives warned you about. You wanted independence? Congratulations. You get embroidery. Your mornings are filled with it. You pick up your hoop and thread before breakfast, stabbing fabric with the resigned determination of someone proving she is not idle. Idle women invite suspicion. Industrious women are at least tolerated. Every stitch is a small performance, a signal to the household that you are contributing. You embroider roses, lilies, initials, occasionally slipping in a hidden word only you will ever notice. A silent rebellion stitched into linen. Refusing marriage, you discover, doesn't end the proposals. It just changes them. Now, instead of hopeful suitors, you get offers of opportunities. Will you keep house for your brother's growing family? Will you help tutor your niece in French verbs? Will you take on the role of companion to a wealthy aunt, smiling politely through endless games of whist? The world assumes you have time because you didn't tether yourself to a man. Your independence becomes everyone else's convenience. And yet, there is a strange freedom in it. No husband to answer to. No small children shrieking at dawn. No constant demands for meals or mended socks. Your days are your own, even if society insists on calling them wasted. You can read if you dare. You can write letters without someone peering over your shoulder. You can walk alone, head high, and pretend you do not hear the whispers. Still, the consequences linger. Your refusal to marry will shadow you at every meal, every church service, every family gathering. At breakfast, the conversation will drift inevitably to engagements, other people's engagements. Your silence will be noted. At church, the pews will feel like rows of judgment, and every hymn will sound like a gentle rebuke. At tea, the children will ask bluntly why you don't have a husband, and the adults will laugh too loudly to cover the awkwardness. This is the cost of saying no. Not exile, not prison, just the slow daily erosion of social standing. A life measured in embroidery, weak tea, and raised eyebrows. And yet, as you sit by the window, needle in hand, you feel something else stir beneath the weight of expectation. A sense of self, a knowledge that you chose this, that in a world designed to funnel women into marriage as if it were the only possible destiny, you decided otherwise. It isn't easy. It isn't always pleasant. But it is yours. And if the neighbors whisper, let them, If the census calls you redundant, let it. If Aunt Eugenia sighs every morning and mutters about wasted potential, let her sigh. You are 26, unmarried, and still here. You open the window wider, letting the cold morning air rush in, filling your lungs with something sharper than regret. Independence, perhaps, or maybe just defiance. Either way, the day begins. And you, the unmarried daughter, begin it on your own terms. You've barely finished your morning embroidery when another word drifts back into your mind. That heavy little word society loves to hang around your neck like a lead locket. Spinster. At first glance, it doesn't sound so bad. In fact, once upon a time, it wasn't bad at all. A spinster was simply a woman who spun wool. It was an honest occupation, one of the few available to unmarried women. You spun thread, you made fabric, you earned your keep. Nothing shameful in that. But leave it to the Victorians to twist something practical into something poisonous. By the 19th century, spinster wasn't just a job. It was a category, a label, a reminder that, in the eyes of society, you had failed to complete your most important task, to secure a husband. The census clerks loved this word. They used it the way modern forms use single, except without any of the dignity. To be entered in official records as a spinster was to be branded, not with occupation, but with absence. You weren't defined by what you did. You were defined by what you didn't do. You didn't marry. You didn't produce heirs. You didn't fulfill the destiny neatly prepared for you. And the clerks wrote it down, one quill stroke at a time, as if your entire existence boiled down to that lack. And as if spinster weren't harsh enough, the language got worse. Old maid. That one carried a sour tang, conjuring images of sour-faced women clinging to their cats, drifting around their relatives' houses like unwanted ghosts. A domestic warning sign. Marry, or this is your fate. And then there's the word almost too ridiculous to believe. Thornback. Supposedly reserved for women who reached their mid-20s unmarried, likened to a spiny fish best left untouched. Imagine it. You refuse 2 or 3 proposals, you make it to 26 with your dignity intact, and society promptly compares you to an aquatic creature with spikes. Charming. Meanwhile, what was everyone else celebrating? Weddings. Glorious, lavish, endlessly documented weddings. The newspapers devoted columns to them. Who wore what? Who attended? What families were joined? Each article was a glittering advertisement for the success of doing what you, in your quiet rebellion, refused to do. If you were a married woman, your name appeared proudly in print alongside the white satin of your gown and the velvet of your bouquet. If you were a spinster, your name appeared in the census beside that damning little label. Brides were immortalized in newsprint. Spinsters were filed away like surplus receipts. And here's the cruel irony. You're not tragic. You're not diseased. You're not cursed. You are simply surplus. Extra stock left in the warehouse, unpurchased, unsent. That's how Victorian society framed it. A cold ledger where women were either married and therefore useful, or spinster and therefore redundant. But think about it. Was it really failure? Or was it simply arithmetic? Britain in the 1850s had 500,000 more women than men. 2.5 million unmarried women. Did every last one of them really fail? Or was society's math just willfully blind? The truth is, there weren't enough grooms to go around. Yet the blame always fell on the women. You might have even felt that blame in the smallest, pettiest ways. A child at church snickering when you walked past alone. a cousin making a too loud joke at the dinner table, a neighbor whispering about how strange it was that you turned down good offers. Every little comment reinforced the label, until the word spinster felt stitched into the hem of your gown. And if you dared to hold your head high, well, that only made you suspicious. A woman content to live without a man must be either cold, arrogant, or, the whispered favorite, unfeminine. Because heaven forbid you were simply human, with preferences, with standards, with a will of your own. Yet in this label, there is something the Victorians never admitted out loud, a sliver of fear. The spinster was not just a symbol of failure. She was also a symbol of refusal. She proved that a woman could survive, even thrive, outside the marital machine. That terrified people. It disrupted the neat order of households, inheritances, and hierarchies. Better to call her redundant than to admit she was independent. You glance again at the newspapers stacked on the parlor table. More announcements, more glowing descriptions of brides and grooms. Your name isn't there. It never will be. And yet, here you are, still existing, still sipping tea, still threading needles, still watching the world go by. Spinster, yes, but also survivor. And so the label lingers. Heavy, unwanted, impossible to peel off. You'll hear it whispered in drawing rooms, read it in documents, feel it in the shift of a neighbor's glance. You are the spinster, the old maid, the thornback, the surplus stock no one wanted to claim. And here's the final irony, delivered with Victorian precision. One day, when the census taker comes to call, he'll note your age, your status, your spinsterhood. He won't note the countless hours of work you put into your family's comfort. He won't note the wit in your letters, the books you devoured, or the secret rebellions you tucked into embroidery. He won't note your friendships, your independence, or your quiet defiance. Just a single word, pressed into history like a brand. Spinster. And society will nod, satisfied, convinced it has defined you. But of course, you and I both know, no word, however cruel, could capture the full truth of what it meant to refuse. You make your way down the staircase, each step creaking like it's tattling on you. The house is already awake, clinking crockery, a cough here, a chair scraping there. By the time you enter the breakfast room, you already know what awaits you. A battle disguised as a meal. The table is set with ruthless efficiency. A silver teapot steams gently, slices of bread sit stacked like soldiers, and the porridge, naturally, has cooled into a gray, unwelcoming mass. The chairs around the table creak with the weight of relatives and their opinions. And then, like clockwork, a voice sharp enough to slice through toast cuts the air. "Any news, dear?" There she is, Aunt Eugenia. She is the high priestess of matrimonial interrogation, the household's self-appointed ambassador of social decency. She doesn't mean letters from friends. She doesn't mean news from the paper. No, the news she wants is engagement news. The only headline that counts. You shift in your chair, pour yourself tea, and try to look neutral. The worst mistake would be to look flustered, because then she'll know. She'll know that the question hit its mark. Aunt Eugenia smiles sweetly, spooning marmalade onto her toast with the solemnity of a surgeon. "I only ask," she continues, "because of course opportunities don't last forever." Translation: you are aging like milk. Your cousin Margaret chimes in, married at 21, already with 2 small children tugging at her skirts. She gives you that pitying look, half smile, half sermon. Don't wait too long, darling. Comfort in later years depends on the choices you make now. You nod politely and stir your tea. One more spoonful of marmalade, you think, and perhaps a fiancé will appear by magic, fully formed, standing beside the bread rolls. But the breakfast table isn't done with you yet. Your refusal to marry isn't just a personal decision. It's a family affair. Every no you've uttered has ripple effects. Families are networks of alliances, inheritances, reputations. A daughter who refuses her duty unsettles the entire web. Uncle Henry mutters behind his newspaper. Plenty of good men about. Can't imagine why girls are so choosy these days. Of course, this is the same Uncle Henry who snores in his armchair, leaves unpaid bills behind him, and thinks a wife's job is to serve soup in silence. But never mind that. He is a man, and therefore by default, marriageable material. You spread butter on your toast with careful precision, pretending not to notice the glances traded over teacups. Every silence is heavy. Every cough a prompt. Every sigh a reminder that your refusal to marry is not fading into the background. It's a daily headline in the household's private newspaper. There is a script here and everyone knows their lines. Aunt Eugenia asks the question. Your cousins provide examples of success. Your uncle mutters about choosiness. And you? You are supposed to blush, giggle, and claim there's nothing to report yet. That hopeful yet is the crumb they're waiting for, the sign that you are still playing the game. But what if you don't say yet? What if you simply sip your tea calmly, as though their expectations no longer bind you? That to them is the real rebellion. Not the absence of a husband, but the absence of apology. You watch the butter melt slowly into your toast. You consider replying with honesty. You could say, "No, Aunt, there is no news. Because I refused Neville and his cabbage breath, and Mr. Harrow with his 4 needy children, and the curate who thought economics was foreplay. I said no, and I meant it. But you don't, not yet. Because direct defiance spoils the marmalade. Instead, you settle into a different kind of rebellion, silent resistance. You eat your toast deliberately slowly. You pour a second cup of tea, even though the first one is still half full. You talk about the weather, about the milkman's accident, about literally anything except your supposed destiny. And beneath it all, the tension simmers. Because in Victorian England, refusal was more than preference. It was defiance. Every time you turned down a proposal, you weren't just rejecting a man. You were rejecting the entire system built around him. Marriage was wealth, property, status, stability. And by refusing it, you signaled something dangerous, that a woman might choose differently. The family senses that danger, even if they can't name it. So they push harder. Every breakfast becomes a skirmish, fought with teaspoons instead of swords, sighs instead of muskets. And you? You smile sweetly, stir your tea, and think, if survival means enduring 1,000 bowls of passive-aggressive porridge, then so be it. You can outlast porridge. The truth is, you already know that nothing you say will satisfy them. If you promise to try harder, they'll sigh with relief. But wait expectantly. If you insist you're content, they'll smile tightly and whisper later about how you're strange. If you make a joke, they'll roll their eyes and say you're covering. The only true victory would be an engagement ring glinting on your finger. Anything less is failure disguised as breakfast. But you've made your choice, and so the ritual repeats. Tomorrow it will be the same. The tea will steam, the toast will crunch, Aunt Eugenia will clear her throat, and the questions will come again. Any news, dear? And perhaps one day, instead of dodging, you'll look her straight in the eye and say, yes. The news is that I am not marrying. The news is that I am not a headline in your paper, nor a pawn in your matchmaking. The news is that this marmalade is excellent, and I'll take another spoonful, thank you very much. Until then, you sip quietly and let the silence be your answer. And while you're here, don't stay silent like a Victorian spinster filed away in the census. Subscribe, or history will mark you as forgotten too. You've survived breakfast, Aunt Eugenia's sighs, Uncle Henry's muttering, the porridge of judgment, only to discover that the scrutiny doesn't stop at the family table. It stretches across the entire country. Because in 1851, Britain woke up to a terrifying statistic. There were 500,000 more women than men. 500,000. Imagine the panic. Imagine the clergymen clutching their prayer books, the essayists scrambling for their quills, the matrons whispering over their teacups. And in the census records, the numbers stood stark and undeniable. 2.5 million unmarried women. To a society convinced that a woman's only true function was marriage and motherhood, this wasn't just curious. It was catastrophic. You, unmarried at 26, weren't just a family inconvenience anymore. You were a national crisis. The newspapers and magazines called it the problem of surplus women, a phrase so cold it might as well have come from a shipping ledger. Too many spoons in the drawer, too many chairs in the parlor, too many women cluttering up the country. Useful only if they could be married off. Otherwise, redundant. And then came William Rathbone Gregg, a man who, in 1869, decided to grace the public with a 40-page essay titled, "Why Are Women Redundant?" You can almost hear the exasperation in the title. Why, oh why, are there so many of you still here, cluttering up England with your unmarried selves? Gregg's diagnosis was simple. Women who refused to marry suffered from what he called unwholesome preferences. They were unnatural, misguided, possibly defective. According to him, their hearts were cold and their heads astray. In other words, if you chose not to marry, you were either emotionally broken or intellectually confused. And his solution? Ship you off. That's right. Pack up all the surplus women, herd them onto boats, and send them to the colonies to become wives for lonely settlers. Problem solved. Balance the books, tidy up the census. Ah yes, export the problem, like unwanted teacups or excess cargo. England would be cleared of its redundant stock, and the colonies would get a fresh shipment of brides. Everyone wins, except, of course, the women. You imagine it for a moment. You, standing on a dock in Liverpool, clutching a trunk full of needlework and novels, waiting to be shipped across the ocean like a human consolation prize. No say in the matter, no real choice, just reassigned, like a package with the wrong address. The absurdity almost makes you laugh. Almost. But beneath the sarcasm was something more sinister. Fear. Men like Gregg weren't simply annoyed by the presence of unmarried women. They were frightened, because if women didn't marry, the whole system shook. Property went unclaimed, households went unanchored, inheritance lines grew fuzzy. And worst of all, women might start imagining they had options. Of course, not everyone agreed with Gregg's export plan. Other writers fired back. Frances Power Cobb, a formidable essayist, published her own rebuttal, "What shall we do with our old maids?" Her argument was simple. Maybe instead of forcing women onto ships, we should educate them. Radical, I know. Give them skills, give them professions, give them purpose beyond marriage. Cobby pointed out that 1 woman in 4 was not going to marry, whether society liked it or not. And pretending otherwise was like refusing to believe in rain because you don't own an umbrella. Still, Greg's essay lingered in the cultural imagination, feeding the idea that women who refused to marry were a social problem that needed solving. Not individuals, not human beings, but a demographic hiccup, a statistical embarrassment. You sip your tea and consider the irony. The surplus wasn't even your fault. Men died in wars. Men worked in dangerous jobs and didn't come home. Men emigrated in droves to Canada, Australia, India, chasing opportunity, leaving behind a lopsided population. And yet, it was the women who bore the blame. Somehow, you became the problem simply for existing, breathing, and not being married. It must have been strange to live with that knowledge, that every time you walked into church, or sat down at dinner, or embroidered initials onto handkerchiefs, someone was quietly tallying you among the surplus, an extra, a leftover, society's spare part. And here's the strangest part of all. Many of those so-called surplus women didn't actually suffer the way Greg imagined. Some found work, some built communities, some even enjoyed the independence. But in the Victorian imagination, you could not possibly be content without a husband. So rather than ask women what they wanted, men like Greg invented elaborate theories about what to do with you, as though you were a misplaced parcel in need of redirection. And so the debate raged. Were you a national disgrace or a potential worker to be trained? A burden to be exported or a citizen to be educated? Essayists and clerks wrung their hands while you poured another cup of tea and stitched another flower into your sampler, quietly defying the panic. The surplus women problem was never really about numbers. It was about control. The fear that if too many women refused marriage, the fragile scaffolding of Victorian society might wobble. And it did wobble. Because behind the statistics, behind the labels and the essays, lay the truth. Millions of women were quietly living outside the script. Not tragic, not redundant, just refusing. And that, in the end, was the real surplus. Not of women, but of courage. For all the grim essays and hand-wringing sermons about the problem of surplus women, there's one moment in history where the women finally got to speak for themselves. And when they did, the results were glorious. It was 1889. A popular magazine, Titbits, yes, that really was its name, decided to ask unmarried women a simple question: why are you still single? The editors expected polite answers, maybe a little regret, maybe a touch of tragedy. Instead, what they got was a masterclass in wit, sarcasm, and unapologetic honesty. Imagine it. Victorian women, often dismissed as fragile and submissive, sending in letters so sharp you can still feel the sting today. One woman, Miss Sophia Drew, replied, "As there are so many more women than men, we cannot all hope to marry. But please don't think that I am dissatisfied. I am now only a dairymaid. If married, I should be a wife, mother, nurse, housekeeper, chambermaid, seamstress, dairymaid, and scrub generally." You can almost hear her smirk between the lines. She was pointing out what society refused to admit. Marriage didn't lighten a woman's workload. It multiplied it. She already had one job. Marriage meant 7 more, without pay, without recognition, and without the option to quit. By refusing, she wasn't failing. She was saving herself from permanent overemployment. Another, Miss Florence Waite, was even more practical. because I have other professions open to me in which the hours are shorter, the work more agreeable, and the pay possibly better. There it is, the cold economic truth. For women beginning to slip into new professions, teaching, clerical work, even typing, marriage looked less like security and more like a trap. Shorter hours, better pay, and agreeable work versus eternal child-rearing, endless housework, and dependence on a husband. The choice suddenly looked less bleak. Then there was Miss Laura Bax, who really let her imagination soar. Because matrimony is like an electric battery. When you once join hands, you can't let go, however much it hurts. And as when embarked on a toboggan slide, you must go to the bitter end, however much it bumps. You picture her, writing with a wry grin, comparing marriage to grabbing hold of a dangerous machine, jolts of pain, no escape, sliding helplessly to a miserable conclusion. One can only imagine the reaction when readers saw that in print, half of them chuckling, half of them clutching their pearls, and finally, perhaps the most famous response of all, Miss Sparrow. Her words have echoed across more than a century. Because I do not care to enlarge my menagerie of pets, and I find the animal man less docile than a dog, less affectionate than a cat, and less amusing than a monkey. There it is, the Victorian mic drop. Why refuse marriage? Because men, when compared with animals, simply didn't measure up. Miss Sparrow didn't just reject the institution. She rejected the very premise that men were worth the trouble at all. Now imagine you're reading these words in 1889. You, unmarried at 26, surrounded by whispers and pity. And suddenly, here are women like you, in print, laughing at the whole system. Not broken, not tragic, liberated. Using humor to turn the shame back on society itself. The brilliance of these replies lies in their balance. They didn't whine. They didn't rage. They joked. They teased. They made light of the very thing everyone else treated as deadly serious, and that made them all the more subversive. A joke is harder to argue with than an essay. A quip lingers longer than a lecture. As you sip your evening tea, you picture the magazine's readers, middle-class fathers shaking their heads in dismay, young brides blushing with embarrassment, and unmarried daughters, like you, grinning into their handkerchiefs, finally hearing someone say out loud what you've whispered in private. That refusing marriage wasn't always misery. Sometimes it was common sense. Sometimes it was self-defense. And sometimes it was sheer delight. These women weren't anomalies. They represented a growing undercurrent in Victorian life. Women who chose not to marry because they wanted more, or different, or simply peace. The essays by men framed them as cold or defective. The women's own words revealed them as witty, thoughtful, and remarkably modern. And here's the best part. The responses weren't just about self-preservation. They were also about freedom. Miss Drew didn't want to be everyone's unpaid servant. Miss Waite preferred a profession. Miss Bax didn't want to be trapped in a painful contract. Miss Sparrow wanted her pets and her sanity. Each refusal wasn't only a no to marriage, it was a yes to themselves. That's what makes this moment so powerful. For once, spinsters weren't defined by the census or the gossip or the size at breakfast. They defined themselves, and they did it with style. So, as you set your cup back in its saucer and the clock ticks toward another Victorian evening, remember, not every unmarried woman was quietly fading into wallpaper. Some of them were laughing. Some of them were writing. Some of them were tearing down the walls of expectation with a single savage sentence. Refusal wasn't always tragic. Sometimes it was liberation disguised as wit. And perhaps, just perhaps, you feel a flicker of pride knowing you are part of that same chorus. You too have said no. You too have endured the sighs, the labels, the pity. And you too can smile, knowing that somewhere Miss Sparrow is raising her teacup in solidarity, perfectly content with her cats, her monkey, and her refusal. Refusing marriage didn't just rattle your relatives, it rattled the empire. Because once large numbers of women began stepping outside the marriage script, uncomfortable questions started bubbling up. Questions the Victorians bundled together under a tidy phrase, the woman question. What should women do if they weren't wives? Could they work? Could they study? Could they be trusted with their own income, their own decisions, their own minds? It was less a single question than a thunderstorm of doubts, striking at the very foundation of Victorian order. And at the center of this storm were women like you, the ones who refused. Your no became a catalyst for bigger conversations. Because if you weren't going to live quietly as someone's wife, you needed something else, something that gave your life weight. And the obvious answer? Education. The push for women's colleges began in earnest in the mid-19th century. Before then, your education might have stretched only as far as French phrases, piano practice, and enough needlework to impress a suitor. Useful accomplishments for catching a husband, but not for building a life without one. Refusing marriage demanded more than sonatas and samplers. It demanded knowledge. So slowly, institutions began to open their gates, just a crack. In Cambridge, Newnham College opened in 1871. In Oxford, Somerville followed in 1879. Imagine it. Long halls, chalkboards, lecture notes. Young women in sensible gowns, carrying stacks of books, stepping nervously into classrooms where, for centuries, only men had sat. It was revolutionary and slightly scandalous. Of course, the universities didn't make it easy. They let women in the door, but not too far. Yes, you could attend lectures. Yes, you could take the exams. But at the end of all that study, when your male classmates received crisp degrees rolled up with ribbons, what did you get? A polite pat on the head, perhaps a certificate, if you were lucky. In most cases, nothing. You could read Aristotle, but don't you dare get a diploma. The absurdity is almost laughable. Hours of study, nights by candlelight, essays scribbled until your fingers cramped, and in the end, you weren't officially recognized. The unspoken message was clear. Your learning was a hobby, not a credential. Something to keep your spinster brain occupied, not something that could reshape society. But here's the thing. Even without diplomas, the knowledge mattered. It spread. Women who studied at Newnham and Somerville went on to teach, to write, to organize. They proved that intellect wasn't confined to men, no matter how the records pretended otherwise. Meanwhile, essayists like Frances Power Cobb pointed to the education debate as proof that women had more to offer than marriage. If 1 in 4 women wasn't going to marry, she argued, then it was society's duty to provide other paths, respectable paths, to prevent wasted lives. And gradually, that logic began to win ground. Still, the resistance was fierce. Critics fretted that education would ruin women's health, shrivel their wombs, or, worst of all, make them unfeminine. A woman with too much knowledge was dangerous. She might question her father. She might argue with her husband. She might even, and here voices dropped to horrified whispers, refuse to marry altogether. You can almost hear Aunt Eugenia sighing at the very idea. A clever woman was an unnatural woman Better to stay ornamental, obedient, safely confined to the drawing room. But refusing marriage cracked that confinement wide open. The woman question demanded answers, and education provided one of the boldest. Picture yourself, seated in a drafty Cambridge classroom, quill poised, listening to a professor drone on about Greek philosophy. Half the men in the room doubt you belong there. But you sit anyway. You take notes anyway. You refuse to leave. And in that refusal is power. Because here's the truth. The fight for education wasn't only about books or degrees. It was about possibility. For the first time, women could imagine lives outside the cradle and the kitchen. They could train as teachers, writers, reformers. They could contribute ideas, not just dowries. And though the system still placed roadblocks at every turn, the mere fact that women were studying shook the foundations of Victorian certainty. You sip your tea, smile faintly, and think, this is what refusal does. It doesn't just close doors, it forces new ones open. Yes, you turned down proposals. Yes, you endured sighs at breakfast and whispers at church. But in the wider world, women like you were reshaping the map. By saying no to marriage, you created the demand for something else, something more. And even if society still tried to belittle you with words like spinster or thornback, the truth lingered in every lecture hall and classroom. You were there. You were learning. And nothing could erase that. So the next time someone calls you redundant, remember the irony. Redundant women built Newnham. Redundant women filled the lecture halls of Somerville. Redundant women forced the world to confront the question it most wanted to avoid. What if a woman's worth was not tied to marriage at all? And though the Victorians tried to answer that question with hesitation, fear, and half measures, you already know the answer. You are living it, page by page, class by class, quiet refusal by quiet refusal. The woman question isn't really a question at all. It's a declaration. And your very life, unmarried, unafraid, unbowed, is part of the answer. The lamps are lit. The carriages pull up in a steady line, wheels rattling against cobblestones. Somewhere inside the assembly hall, a fiddler is already tuning his strings, and the smell of candle wax and punch lingers in the air. Tonight, you are not just a guest. You are merchandise. Welcome to the marriage market. The Victorians dressed it up in velvet and chandeliers, but make no mistake, this was business. The ball wasn't about music or merriment. It was about bargaining. Girls on one side, young men on the other, and families fluttering anxiously in between like shareholders at an auction. Everyone craning their necks, everyone watching, everyone waiting for someone to choose or be chosen. And here you are, 26, unmarried, and already considered a questionable investment. Your dress is respectable, your gloves immaculate, your smile carefully rehearsed. You stand near the refreshment table, watching couples glide across the floor, and you feel the weight of every gaze. Not admiration, calculation. If you dance tonight, whispers ripple. At last, she's found someone willing. If you don't, the whispers shift. No one wants her. Every step, every curtsy, every laugh is a line item in your social ledger. The punch bowl gleams under the chandeliers. You pour yourself a glass. It tastes weak, watered down, tired, much like the suitors. The punch grows weaker every year, just like your prospects. Once, you might have felt the sting of it. Once, you might have looked longingly toward the dance floor, waiting for a bow, a hand, an invitation. But now you sip your drink calmly, watching the room as if from a distance, because you've already decided. You will not marry for the sake of avoiding whispers. You will not say yes just to quiet the sighs. That decision makes you dangerous. Because in this world, rejection is scandal. A woman who deliberately turns down suitors upsets the natural order. Men expect to be refused occasionally, of course. It adds spice to the chase. But persistent refusal? That marks you as obstinate, peculiar, even ungrateful. How dare you prefer your books, your independence, or even your cat to the honor of becoming Mrs. Someone or other? And yet, here you stand. The music swells, couples twirl, young women giggle behind their fans, angling for attention. And you sip your punch and hold your ground. From across the room you see familiar faces. There's Margaret, married at 19, now tugging discreetly at a gown stretched tighter after 2 children. There's Clara, engaged to a man twice her age, her smile fixed and brittle. They glance at you, quickly, nervously. They can't quite decide whether to pity you or envy you, because you are the unchosen wallflower. Yes, society calls you tragic, but there's a peculiar survival in it. You are not pregnant and pale at 23. You are not tied to debts from a husband's failing business. You are not silenced every time you open your mouth at dinner. You are free in a way they will never be. Not that the room sees it that way. To the matrons stationed along the edges, you are wasted potential. To the young men avoiding your eye, you are a cautionary tale. To the cousins watching eagerly, you are entertainment, waiting to see if tonight, finally, you'll snatch a partner before the music ends. You smile faintly. Let them whisper. Because you've discovered something society doesn't want you to know. Survival as a wallflower has its own quiet strength. Yes, you are overlooked. Yes, you are whispered about. But you are also left alone. You can observe. You can think. You can choose. And so you linger by the refreshments, not as merchandise, but as witness. Watching the dance unfold, watching the bargains made, watching the desperation grow as the night stretches on. Every year the gowns are the same, the music the same, the punch weaker, the suitors fewer. And every year you refuse, not because you couldn't say yes, but because you won't. That refusal is scandalous and liberating. Scandalous because you are supposed to play the part, flutter, smile, accept. Liberating because you've stepped out of the script altogether. It doesn't matter that William Rathbone Gregg calls you redundant. It doesn't matter that the census brands you a spinster. Tonight, under the chandeliers, surrounded by lace and laughter, you know the truth. Refusal is not failure. It is choice. And though society tries to paint you as surplus stock, an unwanted item at the back of the shelf, you know differently. You are not an accident of numbers. You are not a miscalculation in the marriage books. You are a person who said no. The fiddles screech toward another waltz. Couples line up, hands clasping, skirts swishing. You finish your punch, place the empty glass neatly on the table, and step back. You do not dance. You do not apologize. And in that refusal, small, silent, scandalous, lies a freedom they cannot take from you. But of course, freedom is fragile. If you don't subscribe, the Victorians win. Your story vanishes, filed away as irrelevant. Prove you were here. Subscribe. You said no. No to Neville with his cabbage breath. No to Harrow with his debts and children. No to the curate with eyebrows like startled hedgehogs. And every no carved you further out of the marriage market and deeper into another reality, work. Because in the Victorian world, refusing marriage didn't mean you got to sit around with a novel and a pot of tea for the rest of your life. It meant you had to earn your bread. If you wouldn't belong to a husband, you had to belong somewhere else. A schoolroom, a shop, a sewing bench, or a desk. And so you step into the other great marketplace of the century, employment. Your choices are limited, of course. You won't be a banker or a barrister or a doctor, not officially, not yet. Those doors are bolted tight, locked with iron chains of unsuitable for women. But there are cracks in the wall, and through those cracks, unmarried women like you slip. The most traditional path is teaching. Governesses, tutors, schoolmistresses. You can almost picture yourself in a stiff black dress, reciting French verbs to children who roll their eyes the moment you turn away. The hours are long, the pay meager, and your social rank forever suspended, too refined to be a servant, not refined enough to be family. Governesses are tolerated, not embraced. Still, the role offers food, a roof, and a sliver of autonomy. Then there is millinery. Hats, endless hats, ribbons, feathers, silk, pins. The trade is respectable enough for middle-class women, especially those with a spark of creativity and patience for picky customers. You can stitch until your fingers ache. Attach yet another plume of ostrich feather, and smile sweetly as Lady So-and-so asks if perhaps the brim could be wider, smaller, taller, shorter, all at once. It's grueling, but it's independence. You earn your own money, however little. You sign your own receipts. And then, the typewriter. By the late 1800s, a new figure appeared in the Victorian imagination, the typewriter girl. Imagine it. You, sitting at a desk in a city office, the keys clicking beneath your fingers, telegrams and letters piling around you. Men hurry past in waistcoats and top hats, muttering about contracts and shipping schedules. But you are modern. You are indispensable. You are part of the machinery of progress itself. Of course, it isn't glamorous in practice. The hours are long. Your pay is half that of the men in the same office, and the clerks occasionally snicker behind your back. But still, there is something thrilling in it. The typewriter girl becomes a cultural archetype, the efficient, sharp young woman in a starched blouse, mastering a brand new technology. She is independent, urban, and slightly daring. The Victorian equivalent of the sexy librarian trope. Except instead of dusty books, it's a Remington typewriter and a pile of carbon paper. So yes, you refused a husband, but you gained a typewriter. Trade-off? It isn't just about wages. It's about dignity. About proving that you can live without a man's income, that you can carve out a life on your own terms, however narrow the path may be. Your refusal to marry pushes you into these roles, but once there, you begin to see the cracks widen. A governess can save. A milliner can run her own shop. A typist can rent her own lodgings in the city and buy her own dinner without asking permission. For society, this is unnerving. Because once women work, once women earn, the balance shifts. If you can feed yourself, clothe yourself, even pay rent yourself, then marriage is no longer survival. It becomes optional. And if it's optional, men lose their bargaining chip. That, of course, is why the criticism comes thick and fast. Working women are accused of stealing jobs from men, of undermining femininity, of neglecting their true duties. Cartoons depict them as shrill, plain, ridiculous. Essays warn that long hours will ruin their health, shrivel their wombs, and, heaven forbid, render them unmarriageable. But isn't that the point? You already are. And rather than shrink in shame, you walk into the office, the classroom, the shop, and carry on. Picture it. morning in a bustling Victorian city. Horses clop on cobblestones, carriages rattle past, factories belch smoke. And there you are, stepping into your workplace with a stack of papers under your arm, nodding at other women doing the same. A small army of refusers. A quiet rebellion written in wages and receipts. Of course, the pay is insulting. Half what a man earns, sometimes less. Your labor is invisible in the census, undervalued in the ledgers, dismissed in polite conversation. But you know the truth. Without women like you, the gears would grind slower. Letters wouldn't be typed. Hats wouldn't be stitched. Lessons wouldn't be taught. The empire runs on your quiet, underpaid refusal. And in that, there is power. So when someone sniffs over tea and says, "A pity she never married," you can smile faintly and think of your wages tucked in your purse, your books stacked on your table, your independence humming like the steady click of typewriter keys. Refusing marriage forced you into work. But once there, work gave you something marriage rarely offered: a measure of control, a taste of freedom, a life, however imperfect, that was yours. So yes, you said no to Neville, no to Harrow, no to the curate. And in return, you got chalk dust, hat pins, and typewriter ink. Trade-off? Absolutely. Because unlike a marriage contract, your wage slips, small though they are signed with your own name. And that signature is worth more than any dowry. You've refused the suitors. You've stitched your embroidery. You've even found work to keep your hands and mind busy. But society isn't done with you yet. Because in the Victorian world, refusing marriage comes with its own set of punishments. Quiet, relentless, and unavoidable. First, there's the way you're treated in your own family's home. You become a permanent fixture, useful at times, overlooked at others. The Victorians had a phrase for it, though they wouldn't say it aloud. Extra furniture. That's you. You sit politely in the parlor, pour the tea and smile at guests, all the while sensing that you are part of the decor, not the story. You are the armchair in the corner. Comfortable to have around, but not the centerpiece. You are the lamp that no one notices until it stops working. Your presence is expected, but your absence would hardly be mourned. At least not the way a husband's absence would be. And inheritance? That's another penalty. If you think refusing marriage will win you the independence of managing family land or property, think again. Property is passed through sons, nephews, husbands, rarely through you. You may receive a small allowance, a polite term for dependents, to cover your dresses and your board, enough to keep you fed, never enough to make you free. The grand house, the rolling fields, the investments, all flow past you like water into the pockets of men. Even if you live to a respectable old age, your name will not appear on the deeds. You will remain, financially speaking, a dependent child, no matter how many candles you've blown out on birthdays. And then there is the social exclusion. At gatherings, you are seated carefully, neither with the young married couples, because you might depress them, nor with the matrons, because you don't quite belong there either. You are an odd piece to place on the social chessboard. At balls, you are sometimes invited, but only as a chaperone, a quiet body to keep watch over younger, more marriageable girls. At dinners, you are politely asked about your interests, then ignored once the conversation turns to property, politics, or sons' careers. Your refusal to marry leaves you in the in-between space, visible, but not truly seen. And of course, there is gossip. Always gossip. At church, you feel the eyes on your back. At the marketplace, you sense the whispers when you buy bread alone. Some wonder if you turned down offers because you were too proud. Others suggest no one asked at all. A few speculate, in scandalous tones, whether you prefer solitude for reasons they dare not name. Independence makes people suspicious. If you don't belong to a husband, then surely you must belong to some secret vice. And yet, you smile politely through it all. Because what else can you do? Denial makes you look defensive. Anger makes you look bitter. Silence makes you look guilty. Whatever you say or don't say becomes another line in the gossip script. So you learn to take comfort where you can. The cat, for example. She doesn't care whether you are redundant or surplus or thornback. She curls on your lap, purrs in your ear, and considers you the absolute center of the world. At least, the cat loves you. That sarcastic thought becomes your shield. Every time you overhear a sigh or a snicker, you think of the cat's warm body pressed against your skirts and feel just a little less alone. But the penalties dig deeper still. Because in a world where women's value is measured by marriage, refusal marks you as broken stock. And that label follows you everywhere. It follows you to the dinner table, where your portion may be smaller than the men's. It follows you to the church pew, where sermons about dutiful wives feel like pointed jabs. It follows you in the letters you receive, invitations addressed to Miss, long after your younger cousins have become Mrs. Even literature joins in the punishment. The spinster becomes a stock character, sour, bitter, jealous. Think of Dickens. Think of countless Victorian novels where the unmarried woman is the villainess, the prude, the burden, rarely the heroine. You read these books by lamplight, and sometimes you wonder, is this how they see me? Is this how they will remember me? Yet even within the penalties, there is a strange kind of defiance. Because every whisper, every exclusion, every inheritance passed over is a reminder that you are living outside the rules. And while the rules were designed to cage you, you, by existing in defiance, are quietly bending them. Your refusal creates cracks in the system. Families forced to support you discover that women can live unmarried lives. Gossip about your independence, while cruel, keeps the subject alive in public discourse. Even your reduced inheritance proves a point. Women are excluded not because they are incapable, but because society fears what would happen if they were included. And so, you endure the penalties with a kind of weary pride. You are extra furniture, yes, but you are also the piece no one dares throw out. You are sidelined, yes, but you still take up space. You are gossiped about, yes, but at least you're being talked about. And in the quiet of your own room, away from the sighs and whispers, you know something the others don't. You know that freedom has a price. And this is it. Social penalties, cold porridge, empty invitations, inheritance skipped over, whispers in church. But beneath it all, you are still your own. And perhaps, when the cat curls up in your lap, purring like a small furry rebellion, you smile and think, at least I chose this. At least I refused. And no amount of sighing aunts or muttering uncles can take that away. The days are long, and the years stretch even longer. Once you have refused marriage, life doesn't stop. It doesn't even slow down. It just shifts into a quieter, narrower rhythm. The rhythm of a Victorian spinster, or, as you might prefer to call it, survival through routine. Your mornings are predictable. After breakfast, endured, not enjoyed, you return to your embroidery. The hoop sits waiting for you. A circle of linen stretched tight, needle glinting in the light. You stitch roses, lilies, initials. It is slow work, repetitive work, the kind of work that soothes the nerves while proving to anyone watching that you are not idle. Because heaven forbid a woman be idle. An idle spinster is dangerous. She might think, she might read, she might refuse even more. So you stitch, and stitch, and stitch. And yet, this is where your rebellion hides, in the smallest details. Perhaps you stitch your initials larger than anyone else's. Perhaps you slip a hidden word or phrase into the pattern, a secret joke only you will know. A petal slightly crooked, a vine curling into the shape of a letter, independence disguised as flowers. Once your fingers cramp, you set the hoop aside and pour yourself tea. Weak, milky, often lukewarm. Tea is your companion, your ritual, the thing that marks the hours. You drink it alone at your writing desk, surrounded by letters. Because letters, oh, they are lifelines. The post arrives, carrying news from friends, cousins, acquaintances. You tear open envelopes with anticipation. Sometimes the letters are cheerful, describing children, husbands, endless household chores. Sometimes they drip with envy, carefully disguised in polite phrasing. How lucky you are, dear, to have so much time for your hobbies. Translation: I am drowning in nappies and laundry, but I must pretend to pity you instead. You reply in kind. Polite words, neat handwriting, wit tucked carefully between the lines, a carefully placed sentence, a sly turn of phrase, a hidden smile. Letters are the one place where you can be entirely yourself without Aunt Eugenia peering over your shoulder. And when the letters are written and the tea drained, you do what you love most. You walk. You lace up your boots, wrap your shawl, and step into the outside world. The village street, the churchyard, the fields beyond. You walk briskly, head high, aware of the eyes that follow you. A woman alone is always suspicious. What are you doing out here without a chaperone, without purpose? Surely not simply enjoying the air. But you walk anyway. Past the hedgerows, past the cottages, into the quieter lanes where no one watches. Here at last you can breathe. You can sigh without comment. You can hum a tune under your breath. You can imagine. Sometimes you carry a book with you. Perhaps a volume of Italian poetry. Perhaps a scandalous novel tucked discreetly under your shawl. You pause by a tree, sit on a stone wall, and read, letting the words transport you beyond the narrow lanes of your life. A sigh escapes, not of despair, but of yearning. A yearning that may never be satisfied in reality, but which survives in ink and verse. This too is rebellion. Reading the wrong things, sighing over foreign poetry, devouring novels that critics insist rot the female brain. But your brain is not rotting. It is racing, alive, brimming with worlds far beyond the drawing room. Back home, the afternoon stretches ahead. What to do? There are hobbies, of course, respectable hobbies. Music, if you have a piano. Watercolors, if you can afford the brushes. Collecting pressed flowers, if you must. All perfectly harmless, all perfectly acceptable. But each hobby carries its own weight of expectation. They must be elegant, tasteful, ladylike. Nothing too wild, nothing too strange. Even your leisure is policed. So you laugh quietly to yourself as you practice. Because let's be honest, half the time, your hobbies are absurd. Competitive doily making, for instance. Who can crochet the neatest, fastest, most elaborate lace? Or floral watercolors that all look faintly like wilted cabbages no matter how hard you try. And yet, you keep at it. not because you care about doilies or cabbages, but because to be seen as industrious is to survive. As the afternoon wanes, the house fills with the bustle of others. Cousins come in from school, brothers from work, servants rushing with trays. You retreat slightly, neither part of the chaos nor entirely apart from it. You are the shadow in the corner, the quiet figure in the background, present but not central. Extra furniture once again. Evenings are quieter. Candles lit, supper served. The family gathered in the parlor. They play cards, gossip, read aloud. You sit with your sewing, pretending to focus on the thread while your mind drifts. You think of the fields, the walk, the book hidden upstairs. You think of the life you refused and the life you're shaping instead. Narrow, perhaps, but yours. And finally, when the house settles into silence, you retreat to your room. You close the door, breathe, and exhale. Here, at least, you can drop the mask. Here, the wallpaper does not judge. You pull the book from beneath your pillow, light the candle, and read until your eyes blur. Words become your companions, your secret rebellion, your proof that the world is wider than the breakfast table, the embroidery hoop, the sighs. This is the daily life of refusal. Not glamorous, not easy, but laced with small freedoms. The embroidery hides your wit. The tea hides your defiance. The walks hide your imagination. The books hide your rebellion. It is a life of quiet endurance, yes, but also of quiet triumph. Because though society calls you redundant, though your family calls you disappointing, you wake each day and choose again. To live, to walk, to read, to sigh. And as the clock ticks past midnight, candle sputtering low, you smile faintly. Because even if your days look narrow to them, you know better. Even your hobbies, ridiculous though they may be, are yours. And in a world that insists your life should belong to someone else, that ownership of self is the greatest rebellion of all. Sunday morning arrives, and with it, another test of endurance. You lace up your boots, smooth down your gown, and pick up your prayer book. It isn't just worship you're walking into, it's theater. The Victorian church was as much a stage for reputation as it was a house of God. The bells toll. Families file into the pews, their best clothes freshly pressed, bonnets trimmed with ribbons, gloves spotless. You take your place alone, and already the whispers start. Because in this world, church is not just for hymns. It is the weekly marriage market, the gossip exchange, the one place where everyone can see exactly who sits with whom. Couples arrive arm in arm, children in tow, parents nodding approvingly. And then there's you, unmarried, unaccompanied, sliding into the pew by yourself. Heaven forbid you sit alone in a pew. It isn't the act of praying that worries them. It's the optics. The sight of you kneeling without a husband beside you sends a ripple of unease through the congregation. To them, you're not simply worshiping, you're advertising, broadcasting to the entire village that you are still unattached, still surplus, still, in their words, a problem. You bow your head as the hymn begins. Around you voices rise, some sharp and confident, some wavering. You sing quietly, aware that even your voice will be judged. Too soft, and you're timid. Too loud, and you're unbecoming. Everything about church is a performance, and you, the refuser, are under the brightest spotlight. During the prayers, you sense it. A pause, a hush, a whispered addition. And Lord, guide our poor unmarried ladies to find suitable partners. It isn't spoken directly, of course, but you can almost hear it anyway. A prayer for your soul, disguised as piety, really just pity in holy wrapping paper. When the sermon begins, the minister takes his place at the pulpit. His voice booms about duty, about faith, about the sanctity of marriage. You sit, hands folded, nodding politely, while each word feels like a dart aimed squarely at your forehead. Marriage as a divine command, marriage as salvation, marriage as the proof of a woman's worth. And you, sitting there, spine straight, eyes calm, are the living contradiction. The eyes find you again. Mrs. Whitcomb 3 rows back, fanning herself with deliberate slowness. The 2 young men across the aisle, nudging each other, smirking. A child whispers too loudly, "Why doesn't she have a husband?" His mother shushes him, but not before half the pews turn their heads. This is church. Not just sermons and psalms, but scrutiny. Every ribbon on your bonnet, every crease in your gloves, every word you do or don't say after the service is fodder for the week's gossip. Because after the final hymn, when the congregation spills out into the churchyard, the real service begins. Groups cluster together, the men discussing crops or politics, the women whispering about engagements, pregnancies, and who sat where. And you stand to the side, smile fixed, knowing full well your name will be on their lips before the week is out. She looked pale. Perhaps she regrets refusing. Such a shame. A clever girl, too clever for her own good. She seems happy enough, but really, what else can she say? The judgments pile up like stones at your feet, and yet you survive them, because while church is their arena of gossip, it is also your arena of endurance. You know how to nod at the right people, smile at the children, and ask after the elderly without giving them too much to whisper about. You know how to deflect questions with polite answers. I'm keeping busy with work. I'm caring for family. I'm content, thank you. Each reply carefully measured, designed to end the conversation without inviting more. Still, the social penalty lingers. Refusal to marry doesn't just mark your reputation. It seeps into your soul, or so they believe. Pity turns into suspicion. Perhaps you are too proud, perhaps too selfish, perhaps even sinful. Why else would a woman choose solitude when God has clearly ordained marriage? This suspicion hovers like incense smoke. It clings to you in the churchyard, follows you home, lingers even in your own prayers. Sometimes late at night you wonder, is it true? Have you erred? Or have they mistaken obedience for holiness when perhaps freedom is its own kind of faith? You shake the thought away, because in truth, you know the answer. You refused not because you despised marriage, but because you knew what it would cost you, your time, your autonomy, your very self. And if that makes you suspicious, so be it. Better suspicion than submission. Besides, you have your own quiet prayers, not for a husband, but for strength, for resilience, for the courage to walk into church again next Sunday, to sit alone in the pew while the whispers hum around you, and to leave with your head high. Because in the end, church is not only theirs, it is yours too. The hymns still stir your heart. The prayers still bring you peace. The candles still glow warmly against the stained glass. Their judgment may rattle, but it cannot erase your faith or your refusal. So the bells ring once more, echoing over the fields as you walk home. Behind you, the congregation scatters, already trading whispers that will sustain them until next week. Ahead of you, the lane stretches quiet, open, yours. And as you step along it, shawl pulled tight against the breeze, you think, yes, they may sigh, they may gossip, they may pray, but at least the walk home is silent. At least here, no one tells you how to sit or sing, or pray. At least here you belong to yourself. You've survived the breakfast table. You've endured the whispers at church. You've walked the long lanes of daily life with only your thoughts for company. And then, padding softly into the room, comes the one creature who doesn't care a jot whether you are married, single, redundant, or surplus. The cat. She leaps gracefully onto your lap, curls into a neat circle, and purrs as though the whole world makes sense. In her eyes, you're not a failed spinster or a cautionary tale. You're warm, you're steady, you're hers. It's no wonder Victorian spinsters leaned on their pets. Cats, dogs, birds, even turtles became steadfast allies in the lonely trenches of social exclusion. When men disappointed and relatives sighed, the animals stayed. They didn't scold, they didn't pity, they didn't demand dowries. They simply existed beside you, offering affection without conditions. The Victorians, of course, noticed. And they mocked it. Caricatures of crazy cat ladies appeared in satirical sketches, always with a sour-faced woman surrounded by felines. Writers sneered at spinsters, substituting cats for children. But really, was that such a bad trade? Children screamed, husbands demanded, households consumed. Cats, they purred, dogs wagged their tails, birds sang. Even the occasional hedgehog kept itself to itself. You sit back in your chair, stroking the cat's fur, and think with a faint smile, menagerie, marriage. Consider the alternatives. Neville, with his cabbage breath, or a tabby who curls neatly by the fire. Harrow, with his debts and his endless children, or a terrier who dances with joy when you come home. The curate with his eyebrow sermons, or a canary who sings cheerfully no matter how dull the day. Honestly, there's no contest. Your relatives, of course, see it differently. They sigh at your devotion to animals, as though it proves your unnaturalness. They mutter, "She's always fussing over those cats," as if their gossip weren't proof of fussing over something equally pointless. But you know better. Animals give what society withholds, companionship without judgment, and pets filled Victorian homes everywhere, not just spinster ones. Middle-class families adored their lapdogs, their parrots, their canaries. Queen Victoria herself kept a veritable zoo of beloved pets, yet somehow, when a married woman lavished affection on her pug, it was charming. When an unmarried woman lavished affection on hers, it was pathetic. That double standard doesn't bother the cat. She yawns, stretches, and presses her paws against your skirt as though to remind you of her priorities. Food, warmth, love, none of which require a husband. Sometimes you walk your dog through the village, head high, his tail wagging proudly. He's a loyal shield, a buffer between you and the whispers. Children run to pet him. Neighbors nod politely. He legitimizes your presence in the street in ways no embroidery hoop ever could. And yet, even here, the gossip lingers. Ah, yes, she prefers her dog to a man. To which you might reply, if you dared, who wouldn't? Even the smallest creatures bring comfort. A bird in a cage singing while you sew. A rabbit nibbling quietly in the garden. A turtle inching slowly across the floor, reminding you that life doesn't need to be rushed to be lived. Each one a small beating heart beside your own. And behind the satire, there is a deeper truth. Pets gave unmarried women something marriage often stripped away, the chance to give love without losing themselves. A husband expected obedience, sacrifice, endless service. A pet expected care, yes, but never submission. They didn't own you. They belonged with you. Picture yourself in the evening parlor. The family gathered, conversations swirling about marriages, engagements, children. You sit slightly apart, the cat on your lap, the dog at your feet. They laugh about dowries and weddings. You stroke fur and sip tea, and in that moment, you realize you are not alone. Not really. Your companions may not be human, but they are loyal, affectionate, and yours. Perhaps this is why the stereotype of the cat lady endures. Not because spinsters were sad, but because, in truth, they were content. Their animals brought them joy in a society determined to deny it. And that, perhaps, was the real scandal. Because if you can find fulfillment without a husband, what does that say about the system? If your heart is already full with the purr of a cat, the bark of a dog, the flutter of a bird, then maybe marriage isn't the only destiny after all. Maybe refusing marriage doesn't mean living unloved. Maybe it means redefining love altogether. And so, as you sit in your quiet parlor, surrounded by paws and feathers and whiskers, you feel it, the faint hum of freedom. Society calls you redundant. The census calls you surplus. The neighbors call you odd. But the cat, she just calls you home. And in her purr, in her warmth, in her absolute lack of judgment, you hear the answer to all their sighs. You are enough. But if you don't subscribe, well, history will file you away with the redundant women, forgotten and dismissed. Prove them wrong. Subscribe and take your place where their whispers can't reach you. If there is one thing the Victorians loved almost as much as marriage, it was charity. And for women like you, women who refused to marry, women branded surplus, charity work became both a lifeline and a trap. Because when society rejected you, it did not let you vanish into your parlor with a book and a cat. Oh no, it insisted you prove your worth. And how? By serving others. By giving your time, your labor, your energy to causes respectable enough to erase the stain of singleness. So you tie your bonnet, lace your boots, and step into the chilly parish hall, where the air smells faintly of cabbage and coal smoke. The soup kitchen is bustling. Pots boil, children cough, mothers shuffle forward with empty bowls. And there you are, ladle in hand, spooning broth into chipped crockery. Your relatives sigh with relief. At least she is useful. The neighbors nod approvingly. At least she isn't idle. You may be redundant in marriage, but in charity, you can redeem yourself. It's ironic, isn't it? Society has declared you surplus, unnecessary, unwanted. And yet, when it needs unpaid labor, you suddenly become essential. Who else will run the church bazaars, sew blankets for the poor, visit the sick in damp cottages, or ladle out broth to the hungry? The married women are too busy with their own households. The men naturally are above such tasks. That leaves you, the refuser, the spinster, the redundant woman, pressed back into usefulness. The expectation is relentless. If you have no husband and children to consume your time, then your time must be consumed by the parish. Hours spent stitching quilts for raffles, afternoons trudging through muddy lanes with baskets of bread, evenings balancing the accounts of charitable societies by candlelight. And heaven forbid you decline. Refuse charity after refusing marriage, and you are truly lost. Then the whispers sharpen. She does nothing. She is selfish. She is bitter. So you give, and give, and give, until your days are full, and your reputation, while never spotless, is at least tolerable. There is, of course, some satisfaction in it. Helping the poor, teaching children their letters, bringing soup to the sick. These are real, tangible acts of kindness. In a world where your existence is often dismissed, Here you can point to something visible and say, I did that. But even in that satisfaction lies a sting, because the same society that relies on your labor never pays you for it, never truly honors it. At best, it thanks you politely at the parish fete. At worst, it shrugs and says, well, of course, she has nothing else to do. Picture it. The vicar smiling benignly as you scrub the parish hall floor after a harvest supper. His wife praising your dedication as you stitch miles of bunting for the next bazaar. The whole village nodding, not in admiration, but in relief. Relief that you are being put to use. And yet, the irony is sharp, because while you are dismissed as redundant in marriage, in charity, you are indispensable. The very institutions that sneer at spinsters would collapse without them. Soup kitchens, Sunday schools, relief societies, all staffed by unmarried women. Your refusal has, without anyone admitting it, made you the backbone of Victorian philanthropy. Of course, your work must always remain humble. Do not imagine yourself a leader. Do not demand recognition. That would be unfeminine. Better to be seen as the quiet, diligent helper, ladle in hand, smile fixed. The spinster saint redeeming her failure through service. But you know better. As you tie on your apron and carry another pot to the table, you know that your labor is not a penance. It is survival. It is proof that a woman outside of marriage still has power, even if society only admits it when convenient. And sometimes, just sometimes, it is rebellion. Because when you pour soup into a bowl, you are also pouring out the lie that women without husbands are useless. When you teach a child to read, you are planting the idea that life might be bigger than the script they've been handed. When you manage the accounts of a charity, balancing every shilling to the last farthing, you are showing that women can handle money, and not just dowries. Your family doesn't see it that way. They just see you coming home tired, bonnet askew, smelling faintly of cabbage. Aunt Eugenia clucks her tongue and says, "At least you're doing something." Uncle Henry grumbles that charity is wasted on the poor anyway. But you, as you sink into your chair with aching feet, know the truth. Without women like you, half of Victorian philanthropy would grind to a halt. It's not glamorous. It doesn't erase the sting of the word spinster. But it does give you a different kind of legacy. One not written in newspapers or censuses, but in full stomachs, in warmed hands, in lives just slightly better because you refuse to vanish. So yes, society may reject you, but when it needs work done, it turns back to you, apron ready, ladle in hand, redundant in marriage, indispensable in service. And as you set aside your prayer book at the end of the day, you can't help but smile wryly at the irony. They call you surplus, unwanted, a burden. And yet without you, the soup kitchen closes, the children go untaught, the parish coffers crumble. Rejected? Perhaps. Relied upon? Absolutely. Refusal did not always roar. More often, it whispered. Not in the streets, not in Parliament, not in dramatic speeches, but in quiet acts hidden beneath the respectable veneer of everyday life. Because when you refused marriage, society expected you to fade quietly into the wallpaper, to stitch, to pour tea, to smile politely, to vanish. But you didn't vanish. You found ways, small but steady, to carve out a life that was yours. One of the oldest tools of rebellion was the pen. Journals, diaries, scraps of paper tucked into boxes. You sit at your writing desk, candle flickering, ink pot waiting, and you write. Not for the public, Heaven forbid a woman publish too boldly without hiding under a man's name. But for yourself, you pour out the truth of your days, the sighs, the refusals, the gossip, the small triumphs. On the page you are not redundant. On the page you are sharp, clever, alive. The journals may never be read by another soul, but they anchor you. They remind you that your voice exists, even if society insists it should be silent. Sometimes the rebellion slipped into needlework. Embroidery was supposed to be the perfect spinster pastime, decorative, harmless, endlessly respectable. But who says roses and lilies must be your only themes? So you stitch a sampler that looks innocent enough at first glance, delicate vines, curling stems. But hidden among the petals, a message: regret nothing. Or perhaps, I refuse. A secret-stitched rebellion, hanging on the wall for everyone to admire, never knowing what it truly says. Even your reading habits become defiance. While polite society frowns, you tuck away novels with scandalous heroines, pamphlets on women's rights, volumes of poetry that whisper of freedom. You sigh dramatically over Italian verses, delighting in words that carry you far beyond the narrow confines of your parlor. To your relatives, you are eccentric. To yourself, you are alive. And then there were the women who took those quiet acts and pushed them further. Teachers who refused marriage and instead poured their energy into schools for girls. Activists who attended meetings, wrote essays, marched cautiously under the banner of reform. Thinkers who, in the privacy of their desks, wrestled with philosophy and science and dared to argue that women's brains might be every bit as capable as men's. Their independence was often framed as eccentricity. She is odd, people muttered. She is peculiar. She is devoted to her work. It was easier for society to call them eccentric than to admit they were building new lives on the ashes of refusal. Imagine walking through town, skirts brushing the pavement, when someone points you out. There she goes, the one who refused, the one with her books, the one with her strange hobbies. The tone is disapproving, but beneath it lies unease, because your very existence hints that other women could make the same choice. Even friendships were a form of rebellion. The bonds between unmarried women, letters exchanged, visits made, companionship offered, became small networks of survival. They looked harmless. Two women drinking tea together or strolling in the park. But in truth, those moments were acts of defiance, support, encouragement, solidarity, proof that you were not as alone as society wanted you to believe. Of course, the world mocked these friendships too. Spinsters were painted as clinging together out of desperation. But you know the truth. They weren't born of desperation. They were born of choice, of finding kinship in refusal. And sometimes the defiance was even more radical. You think of women like Josephine Butler, who fought against the Contagious Diseases Acts, defying Parliament to demand justice for exploited women. Or Emily Davies, who co-founded Girton College, demanding that women not only study, but graduate with proper degrees. These women may not have been the majority, but they existed. Proof that refusal could ripple outward, shaking the foundations of law, education, and morality. You may not be Josephine Butler. You may not march or petition, but in your quiet way you add to the chorus. Each refusal, each journal entry, each hidden embroidered word is a note in the larger symphony of defiance. It isn't loud, it isn't glamorous, but it is steady, and steady is powerful. Because society thrives on silence. It depends on your compliance. And every time you stitch regret nothing into a sampler, every time you tuck a radical pamphlet into your drawer, Every time you choose a book over a husband, you chip away at that silence. Independence disguised as eccentricity, that is the secret. They call you odd. They call you peculiar. They smile with condescension as you fuss over your embroidery or your pets. They laugh at your strange habits. But beneath the laughter, there is fear, because they suspect dimly that what looks like eccentricity is really freedom. And perhaps, years from now, when someone stumbles across your journal in a dusty attic or notices the hidden words in your embroidery, they will realize that you weren't simply fading into wallpaper. You were writing yourself into history, quietly, stitch by stitch, word by word. So yes, you refused. And yes, society tried to punish you. But in your quiet acts, your writing, your stitching, your friendships, your reading, you carved out a defiance that no census, no sigh, no sermon could erase. And if that makes you eccentric, then so be it. Better eccentric than erased. So here you are, at the end of this long Victorian day. You've sat through breakfast sighs, endured the sting of labels, refused suitors in candlelit ballrooms, stitched your rebellions into embroidery, poured soup for the parish, and curled up with the cat who loves you more faithfully than society ever could. Refusing marriage in the Victorian era was never simple. It was a stigma, a brand you carried in every census, in every whispered conversation, in every glance across the church pews. But it was also survival, sometimes even liberation. For every sighing ant, there was a Miss Sparrow comparing men unfavorably to monkeys. For every William Rathbone Gregg calling women redundant, there was a Francis Cobb arguing they were essential. Your refusal wasn't just a no, it was a quiet yes to yourself, to your books, your work, your friends, your pets, to the knowledge that a life lived outside the altar could still be a life worth living. And isn't that the heart of it? Society tried to paint refusal as failure, but the truth is softer, subtler. It was resilience, persistence, a quiet thread of independence stitched into the fabric of Victorian life, one spinster at a time. So tonight, as you let your eyes grow heavy, remember this: you are not redundant, you are not surplus, you are not a thornback or an old maid. You are a person who chose. And though history often tried to erase those choices, they remain in journals, in stitchwork, in stories that survive even now. Better, after all, a spinster with a cat than a wife with a Gregory. Now, close your eyes. Let the whispers fade. Let the candle burn low. You are safe here, wrapped in the quiet defiance of women who came before you, women who refused, women who lived on their own terms. Sleep well.